Good. Well, good evening, everybody. It's my very great pleasure to invite you to welcome you to this evening's event, which, as many of you will be aware, is actually the last in a whole cluster of actually interestingly related events that have taken place under the aegis of Insiders Outsiders over the last few weeks. I'll say more about that and what's in store at the very end. But I'm particularly delighted that our grand finale, if you like, is a talk given by my friend and colleague, Dr. Anna Nyburg, who many of you, I think, will have encountered before in her various different guises. The prompt for this event is the imminent publication on the 12th of March, to be precise, of a very splendid new publication celebrating the 75th anniversary of that premier. We all know Thames Hudson, don't we, one way or another, the emigre founded premier art publishing company of Thames and Hudson. It's called The Art of the Book, and I've had a preview of the PowerPoint. Anna will be showing some spreads, and it looks a very, very magnificent volume, I have to say, unsurprisingly. But let me say a little bit about Anna before we start, if I may. She's officially honorary lecturer for languages, culture and communications at Imperial College London. She's a committee member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, which forms part of the University of London. And particularly relevant here, she's a much valued and very proactive trustee of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation, which kind of backs up, if you like, the Insiders Outsiders online events program. As relevantly, she's the author of several relevant books. One of them is called The Clothes on Our Backs, How Refugees from Nazism Revitalized the British Fashion Trade. That was 2020, I believe. And others besides. She's also were you the co-producer or the director of a lovely film which sadly is not available online as we speak, but worth looking out for, called Refuge Britain, which is actually about the refugee designers, textile designers, who came to this country, including a much more recent immigrant, which I think is also important, I think from Syria, was it not? And most relevantly of all, many of you will know her in this context as the author of a book called Emigres, The Transformation of Art Publishing in Britain, which was published not by Thames and Hudson, but by Phaidon way back in 2014. So she is more than qualified to talk about this new book. So I think without further ado, let me hand over to Anna.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Monica. I'll give you a bit of backstory. In 2023, I was invited to the offices of Thames and Hudson, and they asked me if I would write the historical part of this very large, splendid book, which Monica has referred to. I can just about lift it to show you. It's very heavy, it weighs over a kilo. The reason that they chose me was, as Monica's mentioned, I have a book out called Emigres, The Transformation of Art Publishing in Britain, and that was based on my PhD, which really was on the subject of those two companies, Phaidon and Thames and Hudson, both of which were founded by Viennese emigres. I was to be helped acquire all the information for the book by interviewing staff, both current and retired, and importantly, to spend time with Thomas Neurath, who ran the company. He was the son of the founder and ran the company for some 50 years. That was a wonderful experience, I have to say. But after a few sample texts that I sent in, I was told it's not quite what they wanted. What they really wanted was much more emphasis on the books and the authors rather than on the staff, particularly on the refugee staff that I myself was particularly interested in. But today, I think, because we're in the context of insiders, outsiders, I am going to spend a little bit more time on the early history and indeed on those very important refugee and survivor contributors to the great success of Thames and Hudson. We're going to focus, first of all, on the most important part. I've got to share my PowerPoint. Okay. I think I should be able to. It says, Monica, it says sharing is not turned on. Can you hear me, Monica?
A minute, I need to make you co-host again, I think, don't you?
Sorry, yes.
No, it's absolutely fine because you had to exit.
Oh, yes, that's
Yes,
right.
indeed. All will be
Problems
well.
earlier.
Hold on a second. Try again. Should be fine now.
There we go.
Good.
All is well.
Yeah.
Except that I'm on the wrong slide, but that's okay.
Mm.
Share and
Looking promising. Apologies, everybody. We
promising,
had
but
some technical
on the wrong
issues.
slide.
Let's go back up to the
Sorry.
top and go full screen, and all will be well.
Sorry, everybody. Annoying when it's not the right slide. There we are.
Right.
That's the beginning. That's the beginning. Yes. Anyway, this is should be the first slide because we're going to talk about Walter Neurath, who you can see here in the top left-hand corner, sketched by his very good friend Oskar Kokoschka, the famous artist, and beneath him is a sketch of his son Thomas by the same artist. Walter Neurath was born in 1903 into an assimilated Jewish family in Vienna. Now, it is true that Thames and Hudson was co-founded. It was not just Walter Neurath, but also the woman who was to be his third wife, Eva Feuchtwang. But the reason that I'm not going to talk so much about here is that really it was he who brought the publishing experience from Vienna. Eva had never worked in publishing. And also, Thames and Hudson quite recently produced a monograph on Eva Neurath, who you can see here on the left, again with their friend Oskar Kokoschka. So I wouldn't want you to think that Eva had been neglected in any way. The story starts in Vienna, in that wonderful period known as Red Vienna. It started as a left-wing regime at the end of the First World War, and continued until it was destroyed by Austro-fascism in 1934. This short-lived, left-wing, very progressive regime was an exciting time of wonderful social housing, some of which still exists today. There was education for all, free art education for children. There were gyms, theatres, concerts. It was really a really very exciting time. There was a strong focus on children and young people, which was a relatively new idea, I think. Sociology and psychology flourished at that time. There was also a new social and sexual freedom. This perhaps reminds us a little bit of swinging London in the 60s, perhaps even more so than in some cases. Walter Neurath embraced this new age with enthusiasm. He was very left-wing himself, a strong social democrat, never a communist. He lived in a commune as a young man. There were six of them altogether, three men and three women. One of the men was Bruno Bettelheim, the psychoanalyst. And indeed, the men drew lots to marry off the women. And this was just to pacify their more conservative neighbors. That was his first marriage. He was very much a product of Red Vienna. Throughout his life, he would be driven by an urge to educate young people, not only young people, but perhaps people without an education, a university education, and to show them the world, especially the world of culture in all its forms, but with emphasis on that word show through images. He enrolled at Vienna University in the Faculty of Philosophy, but crucially, he also chose to study art history and archaeology, both later pillars of Thames and Hudson publishing. I have here in the book a very short excerpt from a CV from that time. At the same time, he said, I took up lecturing in history of art at institutions similar to the Workers' Education Association in this country, in Britain. I took part in an organization of an art exhibition, and in 1925 went to Paris to organize a successful exhibition of French 19th century painting. In 1924, I started studying book production and typography and designed for the Viennese exhibition of 1924 the catalogue, which was considered to be an outstanding example of modern typography. At the university, I was a founding and active member of the anti-Nazi students' organization. And if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the spreads, the catalogue that he mentioned there. So you have to remember it's actually 100 years old now, but it's very modern looking still. You can see the typical um, sort of sans serif typefaces and asymmetrical book design, which was very state of the art in the 1920s. And the design of books continued to be very important for him. However, his studies were cut short when his father fell ill, and Walter Neurath had to take over the running of the coffee and tea importing business that his father ran. But this, of course, stood him in good stead for later because he learned how to run a company and he learned about marketing and various other skills necessary for that job. As soon as his father was better again, he took up jobs in various publishing companies, 4 in all, I think, before he had to emigrate. One of them produced educational books with a clearly anti-Nazi bias, but was later inevitably closed down when the Nazis marched into Vienna. At one publishing company, he produced a series for children called Wissenschaft für Kinder. Now, you could translate that either as knowledge for children or science. It was published simultaneously in 7 languages. Again, this was a shade of things to come, a co-edition. At that same company, he met the art historian E.H. Gombrich, later to write the world-famous Story of Art, published by Phaidon and still in print today. But it was Walter Neurath who published Gombrich's first book, A Little History of the World, which did extremely well, but wasn't published in English until 2005, when it finally came out with Yale University Press, and you can read that today. Gombrich remained a very good friend of the Neuraths and wrote the introduction to at least one of their books. Contacts made in those short years were to prove very important in his later career. And he was an excellent networker. He was very sociable and outgoing. By 1938, he was working at the Frick Verlag, another publishing company. But as a Jew, he knew, of course, that his days were numbered. Right up to the end, he produced books such as a series teaching children English, French, and German by the use of 1,000 images per book, presumably very little text. And I know that 2 of those titles sold out in just 6 weeks. So he obviously was already showing signs of being a very creative and successful publisher. But 1938, he received this letter from the Frick Verlag, telling him that he did not fulfill the criteria of being an Aryan and was hence no longer allowed to work in this capacity. I was absolutely amazed when Thomas Neurath told me he still had this letter. It's not shown in the book, but to me, it's like that first, I don't know, it's sort of a symbol, if you like, of the beginning of his new life, because he had to leave Vienna. By that time, he had already married his second wife, Marianne, and she was now expecting their first child, who would be Constance. And he had to flee Vienna to Britain, where he already had very many good contacts. The story goes that with typical Neurath chutzpah, he arranged for the moving of his various goods out of the back door of their flat in Vienna, while at the front door, his mother kept the Gestapo busy so that they wouldn't see what they were moving out with pleasant conversation. And so they were able to remove not only their lovely furniture and china and so on, but also important paintings by Egon Schiele, Gustav Klimt, and Oskar Kokoschka. And they all made their way to Britain. In the home counties, they moved in with the Margison, Viscount and Lady Margison, and they were to live there for 5 years. Their daughter Constance was born in 1938, and 1940, Thomas, their son, was born. Neurath had very quickly found himself a job with a company called Adprint, owned by a very charismatic, interesting man, a Viennese Jew like himself, called Wolfgang Voges. Ad print is a composite of advertising and print, and Voges back in Vienna had just run a company for printing small print jobs, ephemera, advertising, and so on, mostly in Czechoslovakia. But he too had moved to Britain quite easily because he was used to moving around, selling the printing space. And he offered Walter the job of being the production manager. In Britain, Adprint became known as a book packager. Book packaging had actually been thought up in Vienna by Walter Neurath and his friend Harry Fischer. Now, forgive me if you already know, but this is a system whereby you think up a subject for a book, you source a good author, then you arrange for the design of the book and the printing, and when the whole book is ready, you sell it on to a publisher for distribution and sales. This worked particularly well during the Second World War. And of course, you must bear in mind that the Neuraths came to Britain in 1938 and the war broke out in 1939. So it was quite soon afterwards. So Adprint, I'm always amazed that I'd never heard of it before my research, but now I'm just amazed that it's not better known. Here is just one of Walter's books, the books he was responsible for. This one came out in 1943. He was responsible as a production manager for the printing, which took place in Scotland, and for all sorts of things, including overseeing the design. You see that it's the text is by J.B. Priestley. Authoritative authors, you will see, were very important, both at Adprint and later at Thames and Hudson. And in the flyleaf, sorry, it's not a good image at all, but you can just about make out here some isotypes. Isotype had been invented by yet another Viennese emigre, Otto Neurath, no relation to Walter, and it was a system for showing statistics. So each little figure represented so many thousand, and you could see at a glance what the trends were. And these isotypes were used a lot, both in books and in animation during the war. So Adprint was most famous for a series called Britain in Pictures. And on the right-hand side, you should be able to see some of the covers there. There are only a few there, but in total, they produced about 163 titles, mostly during the wartime period. And in fact, they were considered to be very good soft propaganda, reminding the Britons of what they were fighting for: English country houses, early Britain, British dramatists, the birds of Britain, and also to remind people in the dominions that they were very keen to have on board as well. Now, there were several features of Britain in Pictures, which were important not just at the time, but because they would be taken on, carried through by Walter Neurath to his new company, Thames and Hudson. You may notice that the authors are quite well known. Look, we've got John Betjeman, Vita Sackville-West, Rose Macaulay, Chiquetta Hawkes, Graham Greene, John Piper. The authors were very important. They were experts, they were authorities, and they were respected authors. People like the archaeologist Chiquetta Hawkes would be taken on by Thames and Hudson as a series of one of their archaeological, she was the series editor for one of the archaeology series. So the authors are very important. Also important was the very modern, for the time, design. The covers may not look modern to you, but they were very exciting and modern looking and streamlined for the 1940s. Another aspect of Britain in Pictures was one very dear to Walter Neurath, and that was that he felt it was very important to have the text and the image integrated wherever possible, rather than in a conventional book where you would read the text and then leaf through to the middle to find the images printed perhaps on different paper, or perhaps they were gathered at the end of the book. He thought that it was a different experience to both read and see at the same time. So those are a few of the important features about Britain in pictures, but there's another one. It so happens that there was a disproportionate number of refugees working behind the scenes. They had come from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and so on, and they brought with them their expertise from the homeland. Just one person is Ruth Rosenberg. I never got to meet her, but she was a very important presence much later at Thames and Hudson as well. Now, she was a picture researcher. Picture researcher was not a profession that you could find in Britain in the 1940s. It just didn't exist. But back in Berlin, Ruth Rosenberg had worked with a huge publishing giant, Ullstein, and they had their own photographic library, and people like Ruth would then source the right image for whichever newspaper, journal, or book they were making at that time. So she brought with her not just the expertise of being a picture researcher, but actually a small photographic archive of her own. And we'll come back to her when we come to Thames and Hudson. So we got up to 1940, and that was the year, you may well know, of the internment crisis. We have 80,000, some 80,000 refugees who've arrived in Britain by then. And after the fall of France and the Netherlands and Norway, there was a great fear that perhaps among these 80,000 people were harbored some fifth columnists, people who were actually sympathetic to the Nazis and might be secretly plotting to help them occupy Britain. So there was a mass internment policy with thousands of men, women, and children going mostly to the Isle of Man. Walter Neurath only was interned for 2 weeks because the government knew and recognized the important propaganda role of his Britain in Pictures series. But while he was in the camp, he was approached by another Viennese refugee known as, whose name was Wilhelm Feuchtwang. And Feuchtwang asked Neurath to go and look up Feuchtwang's wife, Eva. She was in London with a baby, Stefan Feuchtwang, and she didn't have any work or any source of income. And you can imagine the benefits didn't exist in those days, and she was pretty desperate. Walter Neurath went to visit her and immediately was impressed by what experience she'd had back in Berlin and offered her a job at Adprint. And you can read letters from Eva in the wonderful Publishers Archive at the University of Reading, arranging for the production and design of Adprint books. So all was going well. Britain in Pictures was selling, I think they sold 3 million, had sold 3 million by the early 1950s. That they were doing well, but there was a problem. We had Walter Neurath and Wolfgang Vogas. They not only had in common that they were Viennese Jewish refugees, but they were both very entrepreneurial, very creative, very strong-minded characters, and there was the inevitable clash. Walter didn't like working for somebody else. He wanted to set up his own company. So together with Eva, in 1949, they decided they would set up an illustrated and art publishing house. It was to be named Thames and Hudson after the rivers of London and New York, where they had very good contacts with museums and other publishers with whom they wanted to set up distribution contacts. The Neuraths remarked that, in fact, it could have been named after many other rivers as well. It was always an international publisher, but certainly anything was probably better than Neurath and Feuchtwang, which I think would have been a mouthful for most Brits. They invited the printer Gerald and the photographic blockmaker Gilchrist to be on their board of directors as well, a good pragmatic decision. There's a quote from Walter Neurath: "I found the market for art books in England to be non-existent, so we had to create art books in disguise." They didn't only publish art books, and initially all sorts of books were published, even a novel, but otherwise, and later, all their books would indeed be illustrated. The colophon, the publisher's icon, was to be a dolphin, in fact, two dolphins. They're symbols of friendship, apparently, and one of them is facing east and one of them is always facing west. At the bottom of the right-hand image, you can see different iterations of the dolphin designed by different people at different times, but they are very much still, they say Thames and Hudson. The very first Thames and Hudson title was published in 1950, and it was due to Eva's initiative. She had been in the at the publisher Collins. I should have explained that Collins was the publisher that Adprint mostly had worked with. The reason was that during the war there was a shortage of paper and it was rationed. And the allocation of paper was based on previous consumption. So just before the war, Collins had used a lot of paper, and that meant they were entitled to have a lot of paper, and hence they were very happy for Adprint to turn up with their packaged books. So Eva would quite often be at Collins, and once she was there and she noticed all the proofs for this book, English Cathedrals, with photographs by the Swiss photographer Martin Hüllemann. But she was told presumably by Billy Collins, that Collins had actually decided not to publish it after all because it was going to be too expensive. And she and Walter took a huge gamble, and Walter bought 13,000 sets of these photographic illustrations, having previously sold 10,000 copies of the finished book to a publisher in America. It was a good choice, a good bet, because the book was still in print in 1971, so 21 years later, selling over 20,000 copies. Reviewers praised the quality of the photographs, lovely, rich photography, and the reproduction. And these were sort of hallmarks of later Thames and Hudson design. Generally, reviews of early titles of teenage books included phrases like jargon-free, or for the average reader, or appealing to non-specialists. These are qualities which were and still are part of Thames and Hudson's USP. In 1956, that early, 6 of teenagers' books were chosen as being among the best designed books of the year by the National Book League, and I think they were exhibited at the Festival Hall. In 1951, Marianne Neurath died, and in 1953, Walter Neurath and Eva Feuchtwang married. It would be a third marriage for both of them. In the new book, there's a long section on how the new company made use of the many contacts that Walter Neurath had built up in his pre-war career. Too many to go into here. Just one example, somebody who changed his name to Fred Prager, who had emigrated from Austria to the USA post-war. It was his job to identify publishers who had not been, so to say, contaminated by the Nazis. They had not gone along with Nazi propaganda in their publishing. They were clean. And so this enabled them to allow him to give them a license to publish. One of the publishers he chose was the French publisher Fernand Hazan. Together with T&H, they produced a small black hardback entitled Picasso, a study of his work, which was by the authors Frank Elgar and Robert Maillard. They sold 12,500 copies in just 14 months. This success inspired Eva, and particularly Walter, who is very keen on series, to start a new series called The World of Art. According to Walter, it was the right format, the right vehicle, and the right price. And we have some early copies here. So they were always small and they had this black background. Eventually they were softback, hardback to start with, but they were very cheap and they were so very accessible. And these were very, very popular with art students, but also people who just wanted to visit art galleries and exhibitions generally. And I think I can say that they were first of their kind on the market. More recently, the design has changed. They don't have this black background anymore, but the series is absolutely huge. Often in bookshops, you'll see them on a spinner of their own. And now you will see them with their new smart new design as well. Now, I would like to look briefly at three people who were contributors to T&H's success and who were refugees or survivors. The first one is called Werner Gutmann. You can see him here. He had the enormously important job of being the production manager. He had come from a Jewish family in Berlin. He was born in 1924 and come with his father in 1936 to Britain. In Britain, his uncle had come earlier and had acquired a small defunct publishing company called Hammond and Hammond. Werner's mother stayed behind in Berlin and was murdered in the Holocaust. When he was properly grown up and educated, Werner took on a job at Hammond and Hammond, learning all the jobs that you have to do in a publishing company. But one day he saw Thames Hudson books at the festival hall, and he was very smitten and applied for a job at T&H and was taken on. So you have to say he didn't bring with him any German printing or publishing experience. He was too young, but he brought other things with him. For example, he was a very good linguist. Like very many European Jews, he spoke several languages, including fluent French and Russian. And perhaps it's true to say that Jews have always been people on the borders ready to move at any time. And that was certainly true of Werner Gutmann. Initially, Thames and Hudson in those days printed in Germany and Switzerland, so his fluent German was particularly useful. And apparently in those days, in the 50s and 60s, it was quite usual at Thames and Hudson to hear the hum of German being spoken in the offices. I think it's important to say they weren't just taken on out of pity. Walter Neurath was a businessman, although he may well, of course, have had and understood all too well what they had been going through, that he took on people who would be good for the business. We've already met Ruth Rosenberg at Adprint, and she was eventually persuaded to come and work for Thames and Hudson too. And Walter Neurath's daughter Constance told me that Ruth Rosenberg had no family. She lost all her family. And she befriended the painter and Thames and Hudson author Frank Auerbach. They were doing a book together later on in the 90s and had to work together. But really, she thought that they developed quite a mother and son relationship, because Auerbach had come on the Kindertransport, had lost his own family. And so they formed this rather special bond, as well as over the design of the book. She apparently, Rosenberg, there's an interview with her at the British Library. She said that she had no work-life balance, and she spent every waking hour designing and working on T&H books. And she's not the only person I interviewed to say this. And I came to the conclusion that really working for Thames and Hudson was much like having a vacation. The wonderful books they worked on just took up all their time, so that they rather squeezed out other aspects of life. But it was through choice. Ruth Rosenberg was fated for her design, and she won at least one medal, and her books were exhibited at various exhibitions. The next person is somebody called Shalom Schotten. Here in the photographs on the left, you will see him in the bottom left-hand corner. He was born into an Orthodox Jewish family in Austria. It had been smuggled out of Austria as a child. An amazing story. The non-Jewish woman smuggled in with her children and had lived in France and Czechoslovakia before emigrating to Israel after the war. There he started work as a sign worker and a screen printed posters on those sort of jobs. And he worked for a man called Mr. Grundmann, who had worked at the Festival of Britain. And it was Grundmann who told Schotten all about European graphic design. And I think it was he who inspired Schotten to go then to London and enroll at the London College of Printing. At the LCP, Schotten met a man called George Adams, who lectured there. But George Adams had been born Georg Töltscher. He was yet another Viennese emigre, one who had studied at the world-famous Bauhaus. And at that time, George Adams was the art director at Thames Hudson, and he introduced Schotten to Thames Hudson, and eventually Schotten took over his job when Adams moved on away to go and work in Africa. And Schotten became the most prolific and talented, I think, of Thames Hudson's cover designers. In 1975, he won a prize for a book of archaeological maps in a festival, the Nice Festival of the Book. Schotten worked very closely with artists who were the subject of teenage books. You can see in the photographs here, above Schotten is David Hockney with Thomas Neurath. And I think it's true to say that David Hockney almost became a house author and produced so many books. Here we have one of Schotten's covers of a David Hockney book. And in close conversation with Hockney, he had worked out that Hockney was very interested in the concept of reflection. So he has played with the notion here. So at the back of Hockney, you can see, not as you would expect, the reflection of the back of his head, but the front. And you've also got the reflection in the title of the book as well, with a reflection of his name. Just one example, really, of his very creative and striking book covers. I couldn't help noticing that Schotten, Rosenberg and Gutmann, as well as Eva Neurath herself, all stayed working in some capacity at Thames Hudson well into their 80s, if not into their 90s. In fact, it was true of several non-refugee staff as well. The excitement of producing art and illustrated books, as I said, seems to have been something of a vocation. So let's turn now to some new subjects. Archaeology was a subject that both Walter and Thomas Neurath shared a passion for. The catalogue in 1957 announced a new archaeology series called Ancient People and Places. The design was by George Adams that we've just talked about, and the series editor would be Glyn Daniel. You can see a photograph of him on the bottom left, Walter Neurath on the left, and Glyn Daniel on the right. And Glyn Daniel had been Thomas's tutor at Cambridge, but he was also a television personality and a writer of crime fiction, which I think makes him the perfect teenage author. He is scholarly and expert, but he has the common touch as well. Also around that time came out A Picture History of Archaeology. Their first decade of trading was nearly over, but I think it's worth pointing out some of the challenges of publishing books in those pre-digital days, rather, not decimal. Photographs. While they were preparing a book on the Prado in Madrid, the photographer noticed that every time somebody used the lifts, that the lights would flicker and none of the photographs were usable. So they sent off for more photographic film to take replacements. They were impounded by customs and then warped in the heat of Madrid. Similarly, books in the humid warehouses of New York City just completely warped, meaning that thousands of copies had to be rebound. And that's just the beginning, really. Co-editions, we will see, proved even more difficult. Now, co-editions were Thames and Hudson's great strength. You probably know what this means. From the publishing point of view, you start off with the illustrations, which you place on the white sheet, leaving white space around for the text to be put in whichever languages you've managed to bring in to the co-edition project. The more languages you have, the more co-publishers, the cheaper the ultimate book will be. But of course, this is a great skill, allowing exactly the right amount of space for each language. They take different amounts of space. And then there are also arguments about which would be the appropriate cover for the book, depending on the culture. Printing, especially colour printing, which was brought in very early by Thames and Hudson, was crucial to the success, of course, of illustrated books. Now, Eva Neurath had a gift, or some might think almost a curse, in that she was incredibly sensitive to nuances of colour and could spot discrepancies, very fine discrepancies between the reproduction and the original painting. And there's a story in the book which tells that when they were producing a book of the collection of the National Gallery, she was very frustrated by the lack of accuracy between the reproductions and the originals. So she called up the head of the printing company who were doing the reproductions, brought him to the National Gallery, sat him down in front of a painting, which was Rembrandt's A Woman Taken in Adultery, with the proofs on his lap. And he still couldn't see the discrepancy with the colours that she could see. So this was a point of frustration. But eventually they found perfect printers for their cause. Thames and Hudson invited readers to experience a museum without walls, to discover works of art without having to go to cities or different countries. And this was still, you have to remember, a relatively new experience for most people. As the company headed into their second decade of trading, there were 48 new titles. Jackson Pollock, a book on English abbeys and priories, 4 new World of Art titles, more Ancient Peoples and Places, and the first volume of a new series, The Arts of Mankind, whose series editor was Andre Malraux. And they also published a book of Sidney Nolan, the Australian painter's work, making a point from then on of not just publishing European art. In 1961, Thomas Neurath joined Thames and Hudson, working under Werner Gutmann, the production manager. The company was then housed in several houses in Bloomsbury. Werner thought that he'd been taken on mainly to oversee a series called The Great Civilizations. This was phenomenal. So these books had around 1,000 images, but also they had 15 different eminent archaeologists as the authors. And they were to be produced as co-editions simultaneously in French, German, Italian, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. And the first print run would be around 200,000. The printing blocks were created in 3 different countries. I could just imagine the proofs being sent out to these 15 different authors, all having to be checked and sent back in perfect time. It all had to be synchronized. And I have to say, I think of Werner Gutmann like a slightly stressed conductor of a very large, unruly orchestra. But it was done, and it was a fantastic achievement. Things were looking very good for Thames and Hudson near the end of the 1960s until the unexpected and tragic happened. Walter Neurath, aged only 63, died of cancer in 1967. His daughter told me that he had made very calm arrangements for what was to happen to the company after his death. Thomas Neurath, aged only 27, was to take on the running of this well-established company. But he wasn't to be alone. He was assisted hugely by two women. On the left of the photograph, we have Eva Neurath, and in the middle, Constance Neurath, Thomas's sister, who was by then the art director. And I'm assured that Eva Neurath did absolutely everything she could do to support and help those difficult early years of transition from Walter to Thomas, sharing her knowledge of not just all the people, the contacts that she had, but her knowledge of layout and so on. Constance had become a mainstay of the company by then. Just one of her very many inspirations was publishing the very first, not just for Thames and Hudson, but the very first book there was on street art. She was also a very good socializer and networker, so more like Walter, and unlike perhaps Thomas, who was a little more reserved. Connie easily made friends with the many artists who worked with Thames and Hudson. She was good friends with Francis Bacon, for example. There are by now far too many books and authors and series to mention. So we'll just move on swiftly to talk about museums. So they had very important contacts with the V&A and the British Museum, but also museum directors and curators. And they played all a very large part in the publishing success of Thames and Hudson. Thomas went above and beyond, of course, his own father's interests in publishing, and he was responsible for acknowledging the importance of photography as an art form and published many titles on this subject. Generally, design became more important as well, all aspects of it, including architecture and graphic design, and children's books too returned under Thomas after a long absence. In 1999, Eva Neurath died 50 years after the founding of Thames and Hudson back in 1949. The year 2000, the new millennium came with very many challenges for all companies. Brexit, COVID, social media, and of course the new digital age meant not just technical changes, but big questions. Why would people now buy books when they could use Kindles or iPads or could source images from the internet? It was time to defend the printed book, and those who are now heading Thames and Hudson rose to that challenge. In 2013, Thomas stood down as chairman and Sophie Thompson joined the company, becoming the CEO, as she is now the current CEO, and bringing it to new successes. Both of Thomas's daughters had worked at Thames and Hudson, with Johanna staying on as art director until her quite recent retirement, again contributing to the success particularly in the field of photography. When I interviewed Sophie Thompson, she said, "We don't make books for landfill. Thames and Hudson books were always designed to have longevity, with a long backlist of titles still in print." And on the internet, Sophie Thompson pointed out that books have a curatorial function that the internet does not. Expert authors are still needed. Social media can play a positive role in publishing. Just one example. One single tweet from the Smiths guitarist Johnny Marr had ensured that 500 copies of a special, expensive, signed edition of the book, Marr's Guitars, sold out in just 2 hours after the tweet. T&H introduced several new imprints. One embraced a new crowdfunding to help publish small niche titles. There were little imprints on video and computer games, all sorts of new topics. But they continued to work with major artists. Grayson Perry, who was brought to the public eye really by Jackie Klein then at T&H. As a demonstration of the enduring commitment to quality, we have this project on Paula Rego. So they were producing a book called Paula Rego, The Complete Graphic Work, but had found that photographs taken in her gallery were not fit for purpose. So Paula Rego allowed Thames Hudson, in the fall of Neil Pufferman, who was then the production director, to take 80 of the paintings by car to Germany, to the very, very prestigious publisher and printer Steidl, who scanned all the individual paintings in sections and reunited them to form the images that you see here. I think it says a lot for a painter's trust in the publishing company to allow them to take away the paintings like that. There were lots of other enterprises. The commissioning editor, Roger Thorpe, commissioning editor for art, Roger Thorpe, realized that illustration had been neglected, and he commissioned a series on contemporary illustrators, among many, many other titles. The company continued to work with museums, 60 titles with the V&A, but hitherto hidden archives were also a fruitful source of titles. It was Tristan Delancey, the art director, who discovered that in the Wellcome Trust archives, there was a rich source of books on medical topics. And the first one of these was The Sick Rose, the first of many titles based on archives at the Wellcome. Fashion is often considered the neglected child of the design world, but it was when Adelia Sabatini joined the staff at Thames Hudson. She was a former French philosophy student, and she had the really genius idea of producing a book on catwalks of Chanel, something which had never been done before. But catwalks are, in fact, a very, very rich source of archival information. And it was so successful, the Chanel title, that she then produced a series of other catwalk books on different couture houses, including the one here, Vivienne Westwood. Children's books, the children's list expanded, with the children's books just as beautifully produced as any of the art books. And finally, some of the books were artworks in their own right. Design was always very important. High quality design, this is a quote, has always been one of their defining factors to enhance and communicate the subject of the book and to make the physical object appealing and relevant. Here we have a book about the architect Zaha Hadid, and they had, as they sometimes do, a special luxury edition of the book, and it was presented in a red perspex slipcover. When it opened up, the 4 volumes inside exploded out at different angles, a reference to the Russian artist Malevich, who Zaha Hadid particularly admired. May 2024 saw a huge party at the V&A to celebrate 75 years of trading. Very sadly, Thomas Neurath died in July 1925. But he had been involved at every single stage of this book. Indeed, it was his own initiative. Although he didn't live to see the book out, he died in the knowledge that it would be great and beautiful and full of the memories of his father and the pre-story as well of Thames Hudson. In 2025, the company moved into new premises in King's Cross. And I'll finish with a quote from the book. It is fitting that the new London headquarters was formerly occupied by the celebrated Gagosian Gallery. The walls echo with the voices of artists and other creative individuals, a constant reminder that at the heart of all of T&H's endeavours is a desire to share the very best of human creativity with the wider world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was absolutely wonderful. Do you want to just stop screen sharing?
Yes.
Now, I could have listened to you for hours. I think many people will share that. There's obviously so much that you simply didn't have time to fit into this hour's lecture.
It's a very big book. You wouldn't want to hear
It's a
about
very
every
big
page.
story with so
or
many
indeed 70 years worth.
fascinating aspects to it. Let's just go to the gallery view so we can see everybody. Fine. I am aware of the time, and obviously those who have to leave now will do so. And I also obviously have things I would like to say and ask you. But would anybody like to set the ball rolling by commenting or indeed asking Anna something that comes out of her wonderful talk? There's so much there, isn't there? I think we could probably have people just unmuting themselves or putting a virtual hand up if they would like, rather than typing in a question or a comment. Yes, Edward, hello.
Oh, hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Yeah, I thought it was a brilliant lecture, really wonderful
Absolutely.
survey, fantastic and so interesting. But you already know my anecdotes about Eva, sort of, and Thomas. But I just thought it was a fascinating. It was so consistent with what you say. That my experience of being, I did edited the Festschrift for Harold Acton, who was a great personal friend of Eva, and I was then, but it was secret from Harold, but via Harold's boyfriend. I was ordered by who kept the secret, ordered to pick up Eva from the airport at Pisa, because I lived in Florence then, and we'd managed already, I think, to arrange local printers in Florence to do it in letterpress. But there was a chap whose name maybe you know, but a very bohemian character that had worked for Thames Hudson. I should have gone upstairs. I didn't want to miss any of your lectures and looked up his name somewhere, but I think I've got it somewhere. But anyway, he had worked for Thames Hudson, so he got the logo and everything from Thomas. Anyway, it's rather complicated. My memory is bad, but Ava got on I had to drive her to her villa up in the hills above in Tuscany near Lucca. And then she got on the phone to Thomas, and I hadn't met Thomas at that stage, and ordered him to accept this book as a Thames and Hudson book, because we had to pre-sell a certain number of copies because the British Institute was also involved in Florence, and we didn't have that much money. Anyway, and then I did meet Thomas in London. And it was just a very, very good experience, given how complicated it was and how it had to be kept secret. So anyway, it was all completely consistent with your vision of all these other members of staff that I didn't really know about. So thank you very much for a very...
Well, thank you. That's a great story. That's a really great story. As you can imagine, there were very many great stories which I heard during all the interviewing of all the people, but that's what I didn't know about. So,
and I've been writing an account of it in of course your book, some of which is in that also fantastic book of yours. So anyway, I'm sure there are other questions. Yeah.
Thank you,
Suzanne Higgott's there. Yes.
Thank you, Edward. I'm curious to know, in fact, if anybody else has any personal memories or anecdotes they'd like to share with the assembled company, you'd be most welcome. Got some nice appreciative comments coming in, but not questions as such. Anybody want to chip in at this point? Okay, well, maybe Anna, I can just sort of perhaps give some thoughts or sort of fire some questions at you. I mean, an obvious question, well, where to start? I'm just trying to think where best to start, given the time. I mean, what about the Fiden Thames and Hudson relationship? I think, most of us, certainly in the art world, know that these are the two giants of art publishing to this day, both founded by, as you said, Viennese emigres, refugees, to put it more bluntly. Was there a sense of any rivalry? Can you say more about the relationship between them?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, people think just because they were both Jewish and Viennese refugees that they must have all got on quite happily. No, they were rivals. They were publishing as a business. And it's true to say that they they did develop slightly different routes, which made it easier. But there were resentments on both sides, thinking that they'd sort of copied styles at various things and taking credit for things. And there was rivalry. It was often quite difficult. Yes.
Inevitably, I guess. But
Yes. But
yes, indeed. I was also very struck, the importance of the Vienna context in the background. Obviously, there were refugees from Berlin and other places besides, but am I right in thinking there was something particularly about that Red Vienna backdrop, if you like, that bound so many of these figures together?
Well, it certainly was true of Walter Neurath. I think in Fiden, they were very, very different. They had a much more conventional and bourgeois life, just because it was Red Vienna didn't mean that absolutely everybody was a
No,
social
sure.
democrat.
Mm.
But Walter Neurath, to me, seemed to embody all those fantastic qualities of Red Vienna. And there was much longer traditions, of course, of humanism and studying art and all of those sort of things, which combined as well,
Yeah.
much long before Red Vienna. So both publishing companies would have had the advantage of that. Yes.
Indeed. Now I'm looking at the chat, still nothing. I think people are just absorbing the kind of rich array of, material you presented them with. I was also struck, just you mentioned almost en passant that many of the books were printed in Germany, and that made me think, well, that's interesting. I don't know how much, you can tell us about how the main protagonists that you've been talking about, how they felt about working with the
Yes, that that was
yeah.
that was. I mean, they changed printers a lot,
Mm.
and then probably know in the 70s that mostly people started to print in the Far
Yeah.
East. But
Yeah.
again, I think it was just business, It was
Mm.
business. It was business, and they just printed with the best people. Switzerland as well, a lot in,
Yes, no,
and
fair enough. Yeah.
Fiden did as well, printed
Yeah.
in Switzerland. I don't think they felt particularly compromised.
Mm.
I know many refugees would not buy German cars or go
No,
back.
well, quite. That's partly what I was
No,
thinking of. Indeed, interesting, interesting. I also was struck. Yes, no, that's right. You mentioned you showed that extraordinary, toxic letter of dismissal from 1938, and you said again, almost in passing, it's not in the book. And I just wondered. I mean, you did say, and I haven't seen the book. I very much look forward to handling it. But it clearly is the emphasis is on the books themselves that were produced over
yes,
decades.
yes,
But I mean,
yes,
how do you feel? You mentioned, is it Sophie Thompson who's taken over as CEO? I mean, the family presence is there, but with Thomas now gone, it's getting more tenuous. I mean, how strongly do you sense the company feels loyal? Is that the right word? But, sort of, or intent on
Well,
reminding
there are
readers
still
that, that
boards that
mostly. Mm,
Connie is
mm, mm,
represented on, and Johanna, and I
mm,
think Susanna as
mm.
well. So it's impossible to tell what will happen in the future, but for the time being, their presence is definitely, and they're very close. Sophie and the Neuraths,
Mm,
they all know each other very well and
mm.
respect each other, and it seems to work well at the moment. But I can't possibly
Yeah,
tell what
no,
will
obviously
happen in the
one
future.
can't say,
Yes.
but indeed, indeed. All right. Well, I think last chance, everybody. The evening is drawing on. Are there really no questions? Anyway, feel free if you want to contact Anna through the Insiders
Yes,
Outsiders
please do.
email address,
Yes.
please
Often
do.
people think of things later on, don't
No,
they? I know that happens to me.
absolutely.
Yes.
For all the advantages of Zoom, it's not the most conducive to lively conversation. It has to be said. But I would like to just conclude with yes, more thank yous coming in, understandably. And I also gave a wonderful talk about the emigre presence in Penguin Books, which obviously was not founded by refugees, but where they played a very significant part. It features as a recording on our Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know about the YouTube channel, I would urge you to dip into it. There's an awful lot there, though I say it myself, a rich resource of, I think I counted just recently, over 150 recordings over some years now, following the year-long nationwide festival that gave Insiders Outsiders its first sort of public, outing, as it were. And apropos also, for example, internment, we have a whole subsection of recordings on creativity in the British internment camps. So there's much, that actually relates as ever with all these talks, many interesting connections which you might like to explore further via the recordings. This talk will, of course, not of course, but has been recorded. It will feature shortly on the YouTube channel. But I'd like to just end by explaining that there's going to be a break for domestic reasons on my front, I will say, between this last event of our early 2026 series, and indeed late 2025. I'm going to be taking a break, and we'll resume our activities around Refugee Week, as many of you will know, mid-June, and I'm planning a quite intense cluster of, again, it's endlessly fascinating, though I say it myself once more, people are coming to me, so many new books, so much research, family members wishing to find out more about their illustrious, sort of ancestors. So yes, watch this space if you are so inclined. We have a newsletter. If you go to the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website and you scroll down to the bottom right of the homepage, you can very quickly sign up to receive our
May I
news.
interject, Monica?
Yes, of
and
course you can.
mention a forthcoming attraction which Monica is working on, which will be a symposium on refugees at the Festival of Britain.
Yes, I was going to thank you for mentioning that. There's going to be the June cluster of events on a whole range of interesting themes, including a focus on Ireland and on textiles anyway. But if you sign up to the newsletter, which I think the next one will come out in early May or sometime in May, you will find out more. And indeed, hatching plans with Anna and other people besides for an in-person, actually a hybrid symposium, looking at the hitherto really underexplored, hugely rich contribution of the erstwhile refugees, and indeed those from Jewish immigrant backgrounds, to the landmark cultural event of the post-war period, namely the Festival of Britain, to mark its 75th anniversary. So there you are, just a taster of things to come. And thank you so much for being with us tonight. I look forward to seeing some of you at future events. And Anna, a big, big thank you as ever. Wonderfully, informative, entertaining, engaging, lovely.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone, and all the very best. Good night.